Let me introduce myself. I'm Krista Cowan. I'm the corporate genealogist here at Ancestry. And I'm not in my normal environment today in the office. And so if the lighting's a little weird, I apologize for that. Today, we are going to talk about a brand new feature in Ancestry. It's called Ancestry Networks. Now, I just announced this product at the Roots Tech conference earlier this month, and already thousands of you have started using it. But for those of you who haven't, here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to give you my introduction to networks, talk about why it's important to me, and what I want you to listen for as I do that is what kinds of ideas it sparks in your own brain about ways you could use this new product feature. Then we're going to actually walk through the product, and I'm going to show you screen by screen how to do things. And then we're going to wrap it up by talking about some of the networks that you might be interested in creating. And I'm excited to hear what ideas are sparked for you. So that's how we're going to spend our time together today. I hope you're as excited about this as I am. Just a little backstory. This is something that has been in the works at Ancestry for more than 5 years. It's something that we have talked about and thought about and been really intentional about because it meets a very real need in family history. And hopefully you'll see that as I walk through this. Now, I don't typically in these presentations do a PowerPoint. Usually I do just go straight to the site and start sharing things. But I did want to just walk you through the presentation that I gave at Roots Tech so that you can see what it is that we are doing here. That's really important to me, that you kind of catch the vision of networks. So let me just share with you. There we go. Okay. I spend every Sunday night with my dad over FaceTime, usually, although he is on his way to my house right now, and will be there as soon as I get home from this particular business trip. So every Sunday night, we FaceTime each other. And when we FaceTime each other, we are usually working on our Ancestry DNA matches. Now, I don't know about you, but we have tens of thousands of DNA matches. And those tens of thousands of DNA matches sometimes take a little bit of effort to figure out how we're related to them. Sometimes it's really obvious. Sometimes it takes some work, but sometimes it takes quite a bit of work to build out their family tree, to look at the shared matches, to figure out how we're connected to each other. One of the most valuable tools that I have found for figuring out how we're related to our DNA matches is obituaries. And I've probably read, I don't even know, 4,000 of them, thousands of them over the course of the last 8 years that my dad and I have been meeting together every single Sunday night for hours on end, working through how we're connected to our DNA matches. And I have learned the difference between a well-written obituary and a poorly written obituary. And the difference is this. When you read a well-written obituary, you feel like you know something about the person and their family. It's not just a recitation of facts. Anybody can do that. As a matter of fact, I don't know about you, but I don't know if you've ever taken the exercise to write your own obituary. It's something that, like a lot of self-help people say, oh, write your obituary. Stephen Covey used to talk about begin with the end in mind and kind of work through your life that way. And so I've done that exercise several times. And it's really interesting because you can start to turn it into just this recitation of facts that looks a little bit like the profile page of a person in your ancestry tree, right? Here's mine. Born in Provo, Utah, to really young parents. I'm the oldest. You can see my parents were babies. I've lived in 6 states. I've visited 48 countries. I have 6 nephews and the world's only niece. And my singular goal in life is to be the world's greatest aunt. Well, it's not my singular goal. It's my primary goal. My secondary goal is family history education for all of you. And if you just included those things in an obituary about me, it could tell you some things about me, maybe some really important things. but I don't think it tells the whole story. And so that is what I want you to start thinking about in relationship to you and your life, and in relationship to the lives of your ancestors. So let's kind of rewrite my obituary, and we're going to use this concept of a fan club. It's something you've heard about in genealogy. It stands for Friends, Associates, and Neighbors. I believe it was coined by Elizabeth Shown Mills, who's kind of the godmother of American genealogy. And that concept of, in order to really understand your ancestors' lives, and in some cases to even find them when you have hit a brick wall, it's important to kind of navigate around the people in their lives. So here's a little bit about my life. When I was in my young 20s, early 20s, for 5 years, I served as a counselor in a youth program. And then for an additional 3 years after that, I was a speaker at those youth programs every summer. And I often talk about how the foundation of my personal faith is rooted in the things that I learned from my parents. But this really formative time in my life is when I started to develop a value system and a belief system that was my own, that I came to decisions and made choices about wanting to choose to believe for myself. And a lot of it is largely due to many of these people, some of whom 30 years later are my closest friends and some of the most important people in my life, and who I continue to learn every day from about faith. When I was, oh gosh, 31, so 21 years ago, I started my job at Ancestry. Now, I had been a professional genealogist for a couple of years before that, but professional genealogists tend to work very much in isolation. And so this was the first time in my chosen career and passion that I had worked with a group of people who felt as passionately as I do about family history. And these people were colleagues and coworkers that I have learned from over the last 20 years, that I have been impressed so much by their skills and their knowledge. And I haven't just learned about family history, I've learned about marketing and business and social media and friendship and late night research hours together and collaboration. Like, all of that has become this important part of my work here at Ancestry. And 21 years later, some of these people, some of my dearest friends, and they are people that I just so admire. Now, shortly after I started working at Ancestry, my sister and I got a house together, and we moved into this lovely little neighborhood right up on the bench in a little town called Pleasant Grove, Utah. And these people in this neighborhood immediately embraced us. Some of them had already lived there for 10, 15, 20 years. And here we are 21 years later, and they have taught me so much over the course of my life. There are people who have come and cleaned my house after I've had surgery. They shovel my driveway, my very steep driveway, and my sidewalk after snowstorms. They text me and check up on me. They have become some of my dearest friends and closest confidants, and people that I just love being around. So here's what I want you to think about. If you are going to tell the story of my life, when we get to the end and somebody has to write my obituary, my nibblings are probably going to be the one to do that. One of them is going to survive me, and they're going to be given that responsibility. But I hope that they won't do that without talking to Janet and Lisa and Mel and Christy and Jen, because these women have been with me through my life, and the stories that they know about me tell the whole story of my life in a way that sometimes my family doesn't always fully see. Now, I want you to think about what that means for your ancestors. And I bet some of you are going to think about specific family members in your family tree. And if you do, I want you to put it in the chat. I want you to say, think about, if you were to write the life story of somebody in your family tree, whose story would you want to tell? And then I want you to start thinking about what other information you need in order to do that. This is my grandfather. My grandfather was one of my heroes. I adored him from the moment I was born until the moment he passed. And I got to spend a lot of time with him. Maybe not as much as I would have liked to, but a lot more than a lot of people get to spend with their grandfathers. He had a big laugh. He had a big voice. He could, when he sneezed, it scared you to death. He was funny, and he thought I was funny, which just made me so happy. If I could make him laugh, it lit up my whole life. Now, my grandfather served in World War II. And one of the things he would never talk about was his World War II service. I asked him about it maybe 3 times. Once when I was young and didn't know any better to be delicate about it. Once when I was a teenager and was curious about the war and specifically about his experiences in the war. And then once as a young adult, trying to very intentionally coax information out of him and be sensitive about it. And all 3 times, he shut me down. He just did not want to talk about it. Now, my grandmother had things to say, of course, but her information was always secondhand and it was always a little aggrandized. She thought my grandfather hung the moon. And so she, of course, was like, well, your grandfather's the reason the war ended. Like, she just was convinced that he served such a vital role. But he was just a soldier, a lieutenant, who served in both theaters, the European and the Pacific theaters. And I have some photos, as a matter of fact, this is one of them, of him. We think that this was in France. From my father, I have learned that my grandfather was responsible for building bridges ahead of the front lines so that the troops could get through. So it was a kind of dangerous position. And that's pretty much all we know. This is also a picture of him, and there's a little bit of a character here because he and whoever this other gentleman is painted the names of their girlfriends or wives on their Jeep because Doris is the name of my grandmother. So I don't know if they just found a Jeep with my grandmother's name on it and he took a picture with it, or if that was actually his Jeep and he painted her name on it. But that tells you again a little something about my grandfather. But I want more. I want to know more about his experiences during the war. I want to know more about the men he served with. I want to know if any of these men have other pictures or stories. I want to know if any of them wrote anything down, had war diaries, sent letters home that gave insight into what they were experiencing. I want all of that information. And right now, I don't have it. So one of the things that I can now do with Ancestry Networks is start to collect information in a place in my tree on Ancestry to identify these men and to start to research a little bit about their families and who their children and grandchildren are and see if I can't connect the dots and start to collect that information. That's what I want to do for my grandfather. Now, my other grandfather also served in World War II. Unlike Fred, Vernon he kept a war diary. I have a page by page, day by day account of his experience. He talked about it with his daughters. And he died when my mom was 17, so I never knew him personally, but she shared those stories with me. And I have a copy of that journal. And I have all this information about his experience that has helped me get to know him better. I also want to create a network for him and upload the pages of that diary because it's going to allow the other people mentioned in the pages of that diary to find that information about their ancestors. So in one instance, I want information, and in another instance, I have information to share. And that's one of the beautiful things about the family history community, is that in almost all circumstances, we're going to be giving or receiving information at any time. And military service is an interesting period of time in history, and it is a very, very formative thing in the lives of these young men. Even though my grandfather Fred would never talk about it, it affected him. It affected his health, both physically and mentally and emotionally. It affected, I think, the way that he viewed the world. It affected the way that he nurtured the relationships in his life. And so I want to understand this better so that I can understand him better. That's one example. Here's another. So Fred's mom was a woman named Lillian. So I knew my great grandma Lillian. We called her Grandma Cowan. And she was born in Texas in Hill Country to German parents. Her parents were German immigrants, and she spoke German as a first language. To the day she died, she had a thick German accent, even though she was born in Texas. It's really amusing to me because her youngest sister, spoke with a Texas twang. And Aunt Selma was a hoot and, howdy y'all and the whole 9 yards, right? But Grandma Cowan, a little bit more formal, that clipped German accent came out, even though she was raised in Texas. And it was because German was her first language. She didn't learn English till she started school. Now, she didn't get married till a little bit later in life, comparative to most of the young women of her day. And she also was a hobby photographer back in a time when there weren't a lot of personal cameras readily available, but she took pictures, and I don't know if she developed them herself. I don't know what the process was for that back in the 19-teens and 1920s, but I have inherited her photo albums. 3 full big black photo albums. And these are some of the pictures, and they're filled with pictures like this. And I have no idea who these people are. Now, on every page of her scrapbook, she wrote the year and the location. So I have some clues. This particular picture was taken, they're all standing on top of a railroad train car. I can't tell from the picture if the train was actually in movement at the time, but there's pictures of them on boats and trains and in cars. That looks like they're in a parade. Like she just ran around with this group of teenagers and young adults, and then you slowly start to see them leave, and I suspect that's because they were getting married and starting families of their own. And she just continues. Then she drags her younger sister along to travel the country and explore the world. And that is so fascinating to me because I have some of that wanderlust. I just love exploring the world, and maybe I got that from her. And I have all these photos, and some of them, so many of them, are not identified. One of the new features on Ancestry is the ability to upload a photo, and I'll show this to you. Click this button called Recognize Ancestors, and it will see if we can match this photo, this picture of this person, with another photo in Ancestry to tell you who we think it might be. Now, it's still being trained. There's still loads of opportunity for growth in that particular product, but it's exciting, and we've had some early, really cool success with it, helping people figure out who these people in these pictures are. But I don't just want to figure out who they are, because I suspect that several of these are her cousins. Both of her parents came from fairly large families, and she had cousins all over Texas who then kind of just over the course of her teenage years and young adulthood spread out further and further around the country. And I suspect a lot of these are family members, but I can't prove it yet. And so I am going to create a network for my Grandma Cowan and her photo albums and see if I can't start identifying these people. And as I do, figuring out how they fit into our family tree, if they do, and if they don't, who they belong to, so that I can share some of these pictures and stories as I uncover them. So that's another opportunity to create an Ancestry network. Here's the third one. My great-great-great-grandmother, one of them, her name was Rachel Smewen. She was born in a little town in England called Radley. It's kind of near Oxford. And she, when she was 17 years old, with her 19-year-old sister, went from Radley down to London, where she got on a ship called the Amazon. Now, the year was 1863. And they sailed from London to New York City in 1863, which, if you know your history, your US history, was smack in the middle of the US Civil War. When they got to New York, they took a train up and across the top of the country to kind of skirt around the war, and then came down to, I believe, Iowa before getting a wagon train to head west. And she ended up in Utah, where she married a man from Germany. And they then, shortly after their first couple of years of marriage, went down and settled a little town in Utah County called Pleasant Grove, which is where I now live. So random. I didn't know that when I moved there. I knew my great-grandmother had been born there, but I never connected the dots about her grandparents. And so here I had this story about Rachel and about her immigration to America and her settling in Pleasant Grove. What I didn't know was anything about this ship. Now you might think, why would I care about the ship? Well, here's why. I was sitting at lunch one day at Ancestry when one of my coworkers and dear friends was telling me a story about how she had been out with her husband's family the night before, and one of her sisters-in-law had been talking to her about how she'd been doing some family history research, and she had just discovered that her ancestors came to America on a ship called the Amazon, and that must be why she liked Amazon shipping her stuff so much. And she thought it was the funniest joke. And Jen didn't laugh, because Jen also had ancestors who immigrated on the Amazon. And they, as sisters-in-law of nearly 2 decades, had never had that conversation and had no idea that they had ancestors who came on the same ship. So they pulled up Ancestry on their mobile app and they started looking for the passenger list, and they realized their ancestors didn't just come on the same ship, they came on the same sailing, the same date, from London into New York. And as Jen is sitting at lunch telling me this story, I'm not laughing, because my ancestor came on that same ship, on that same sailing. Now, 2 years ago, when we had that lunchtime conversation, Ancestry Networks was already in discussions. And all I could think of was, I need it now because I want to understand more about the people on that ship. Not only that, during that same lunchtime conversation, Jen asked me, she said, "Do you know about the Dickens letter?" And I said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And she said, "Charles Dickens, the Charles Dickens, wrote an entire article in his newspaper about this sailing of this ship. He came and spent an entire day on board interviewing people and observing while they were loading passengers and cargo onto the ship. And then he went and wrote an entire article about it." I had no idea that that letter even existed. And again, I knew this story about Rachel. I'd known this story about Rachel for a really long time, but there was so much context I didn't know and didn't understand because I hadn't researched the people or information around her. And so now here we were, generations later, making this connection because of one of the relatives of one of my friends was also on the same ship. So more than 800 passengers on this ship. This is not going to be a small network, but we've started creating this network of the names of everybody on the ship. And then we are going to look for all of their children and all of their grandchildren, and maybe even come down another generation or two to see what patterns we find, to see if there's any other interesting stories that emerge. For example, I'm really curious, who else helped settle Pleasant Grove with Rachel? Was it some of those other passengers who came on that ship with her and came to Utah with her? Who else in that descendancy intermarried because their parents or grandparents had gone through that experience together? So lots of really kind of cool things that we can start to put together. But ultimately for me, I just really want to understand more about Rachel's story. Because every time I look in her face, I see my grandma who told me the story of Rachel, and her own mother who was born in Pleasant Grove, Utah. And now, because I live there, because I drive past the cemetery where Rachel's buried almost every day on my way to or from work. I feel this connection to her. And so I want to understand more about her story and more about her experiences. So that is really what Ancestry networks are about. They are about how we can take the information we know and look for more information about the people and places and other non-familial, in many cases, people in their lives in order to tell us the whole story. Just like the whole story of my life can't be written without Jen and Lisa and Mel and Christy and Janet. The whole story of my grandpa's life really can't be told without those individuals who served with him in World War II. So on Ancestry, there's tons of records, 65 billion of them, and we're adding millions more every day. There are DNA matches, who you're connected to, who you don't always understand how you're connected to. There's 143 million family trees out there, and there are 1.1 billion photos and stories and documents from personal collections that you all have uploaded to your trees. But we want to help you make them more findable for the other people who might be in those networks with your family members. Just like my great-grandma and her 3 photo albums full of photos of people who might have children or grandchildren just desperately looking for a photo of one of their descendants. So here is the idea. That's the idea behind networks. And this is what I'd like to hear from you again in the chat. So not the Q&A, in the chat, what I would like you to share is, if while I've been sharing this, you've already got an idea of a network you would like to start, a network that you think you would be curious about. Now, again, it's a network about a family member that you want to learn more about, or a network about a family member that you have information to share, or a network about somebody who you just feel like there's a really good story to dig into there. Or maybe it's a brick wall ancestor and you want to start a network with them to start to understand more about how to find the information about who they were or who their parents were, or what else you can learn about them, and you just need a collection point for that. So in the chat, again, if you would just share what networks you're contemplating starting, and then what we're going to do for the last half of our time together today is I'm actually going to walk you through where to find networks in Ancestry and how to build a network. We're going to do that together today. And if you want to follow along on your own computer, you're welcome to do that. If you want to just watch me do it, and then we will have the recording of this video up. For those of you who registered for this event, it will be available at ancestry.com/education. You'll get an email as soon as the recording is available to watch, but then for everybody else, you'll be able to watch it on YouTube within just a few days. And I'm seeing some really great ideas. Several of you have brick walls. Marcia wants to do all the networks I mentioned. Me too, Marcia. There's just not enough hours in the day. Priscilla has a ton of ideas, and she wants to work specifically getting her father-in-law's memoirs published and make those available. Diane has a network related to ancestors who migrated together from New York to Iowa in the early 1830s. Yeah, migration groups are super interesting because oftentimes they're relatives or tangential relatives. Sometimes you know how those people are related, sometimes you're not quite sure, and sometimes there's total strangers in there, and you want to see if they're related or connected in some way other than just that migration story. Ernie wants to do a group of Irish immigrants on board a specific ship. Work colleagues. So Vicky has work colleagues at a mill that one of her ancestors worked at. Yeah, occupational groups are super interesting. And Shannon wants to do networks around enslaved communities. And that is one of the primary use cases that Networks was created for. As a matter of fact, if you whether you participated in RootsTech or not, if you go to rootstech.org and click up on the expo hall. You'll find Ancestry's virtual exhibit booth at Roots Tech. And on that page are 2 presentations you might be interested in. One of them was done by Lisa Elzy about creating the network for her grandfather's World War II service. And she goes into detail about all of the things she's been able to discover about her grandfather's service just because she looked for the information about the men he served with. The other network presentation there is by Nika Sewell-Smith, and she has a presentation called the Trask 250. She has identified a group of 250 individuals enslaved by a man with the last name of Trask, and she has traced the descendants of those individuals, of which she is one, some through DNA, much through just good old-fashioned research. And she has managed to put together a network of more than 10,000 people, descendants of that original enslaved community, and figure out some of the actual familial relationships within that group. And I think that's incredible. Sue has an interesting one. She's going to start a network with her 4 times great grandparents who were part of a Quaker meeting. So yes, religious groups, congregations, or organizations is a really, really interesting one. Joanne says she's just not even going to keep watching me. She's just going to go start doing it because she's so excited about this. I love that. Okay, I'm excited to read through the rest of your comments. If you think of other ideas while we're chatting here, I want you to share them in the chat, both for me, because I want to read them afterwards, but also for each other so you can kind of see and have ideas there. But I do want to spend some time actually walking you through the product so that you can see exactly where to go to do this and what tools are available for you to do this. So we're going to start on the profile page of my grandfather because I have already started a network for him. And so we're going to kind of start at the end and work our way back a little bit. So this is that grandfather that I mentioned that served in World War II. If you go to, I do need to preface right now because we just announced this and because it's in beta still, it's only available on your account if you have Ancestry Pro Tools. So if you have Pro Tools, you have this available right now. That's just who has access to it while it is in beta, okay? Now, if you go to the profile page of anybody in your tree, and then you scroll down, you're going to see family members, of course, over here on the right-hand side. And then as you keep scrolling down here, you will see, if you have Pro Tools on your account, this new button down here called Create a Network. And if you have, let me make my screen a little bigger so y'all can see what I'm talking about over here on the right. Create a network. And if you have already created a network, you'll see the network itself listed there. So I've created Fred Cowan World War II Military Service as the name of the network, and it is a military network, so it has that tag. Okay. You can add a single person to multiple networks, right? So if I was creating networks for myself, I would create an EFY network, I would create an Ancestry employees network, I would create a Battle Creek neighborhood network, I might create a college roommates network or there's, lots of different ways that can look, okay? So that's where you can do it, and one person can be in multiple networks. Now, let's go to this network page that I've already created. Like I said, we're going to kind of start here at the beginning. I'll go back and actually show you the creation of a new network. Because this is still in beta, you're going to see feedback surveys in different places as you interact with this. And we want your feedback. We're so excited to get this into your hands and to have you work with it, and then for you to tell us what else do you need to make this work for you, okay? So here's the network that I've got for my grandfather. Like I said, I gave it this name, and then I gave it a description and a tag. And this is kind of your network home base. And the people so far in the network are my grandfather. I've only got the one person in it so far. And then I've uploaded that picture that we were just looking at. So let me just open it so you can kind of see. So here's that picture, and it's been uploaded to the gallery, attached to my grandfather, and now also attached to this network. And I've put in the details, right? So I know this picture, I know it was taken in about 1944. I could go in and edit it because after a conversation with my father, we believe it was taken in France. And I put in a little description, right? Fred Cowan is on the top left, and I believe these are some of the men that he served with. And then I've linked it to my grandfather. And so you can see when I hover over him, it pops up that little tag. Now, I haven't yet identified any of these men in this photo. So that's one of the new features on Ancestry is you'll see when I hover over their faces, I get a little, who's this? And so one of the things, that, and again, this is a new feature on Ancestry, is you can use this recognize ancestors feature, and it will look on Ancestry to see if we have suggestions for who we think this might be. Now, this is also in very early stages. So you'll see here it just says, well, we think this might be this guy, but it's only a fair comparison. There are some goods and there are some greats, but it gives you enough information and a way to get to their family tree to see, oh, did this person actually serve in World War II at the right time? Are they the right age? And you can do a little bit of investigation. So that's kind of my next task in this particular network is to go ahead and identify the men in that photo. So one of the things that you can do in a network is you can create stickies. Now, I don't know how you do your research, but I love this so much because my research prior to this often looked like a notebook or sticky notes or scratch paper, like as I'm jotting things down and trying to put together all of the pieces, this is going to allow me to keep it all in one place and all connected to my tree, connected to this network, organized, orderly. I love it so much, okay? As much as I love me some good office supplies, I love having the ability to keep all this information together because invariably the sticky note fell off or I misplaced the notebook or used it for something else or the scratch paper got thrown away and I was losing those little bits and pieces. At one point, I tried to migrate to digital and was keeping spreadsheets and Google Docs and all sorts of things. But again, like that information was in all disparate places and trying to recollect it again every time I'd sit down to work on this was useless. So having this information all in one place is a game changer. So here's what stickies allow you to do. I can create a sticky, and I'm going to call this sticky Identify Men in Photo. Use, recognize, I can spell, I promise, ancestor to identify all of the other men in the photo. And then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to add a research status, and it is going to be to do. And then I am going to just attach it to my grandfather. There we go. And save. Okay. And so now I have a little sticky here that is kind of that's going to start a to-do list for me. Now, the cool thing about stickies is you can create a sticky about anything. It can be a note. It can be a web link to something out on the internet that you want to like make sure stays connected to this network or that you want to research further. It can be a bullet list of information. It can like you can fully format these stickies, and you can, if they are if it's time-based information or location-based information. So for example, as I go through those photos of my grandmother in her photo album, I have 10, 20 photos for each trip she took. I could create a sticky for each trip so that I can start to catalog those photos as I identify them. You can create, like I said, this research status, and you can link them to any person. Now, the cool thing about the to-do status specifically is it starts to create an actual to-do list for you on your network's homepage. So it doesn't get buried over there on the sticky page. You can come back to it here. It does take a little bit of time to update, so we'll see that in just a minute. Now, once I start identifying who those men are in that photo, I can add them to the network. And so eventually I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 other individuals in this network. Now I suspect I'll have more because I do have a handful of other pictures. Some of them may be the same men in some of those pictures, but some of them may be unique to those photos. And so I suspect as this particular network grows, I may end up with 10 or 15 or 20 of people in this network that served with my grandfather, or at least that he was photographed with. And then from there, I can go and start to research who they were, who their children were, so that I can contact them and see, A, do they want a copy of this photo? And B, did their father or grandfather ever talk about their time in the service? So that I can learn more about my grandfather's experience. So that's what I'm planning for this particular network. I will be able to upload additional media. I will be able to add sources. So for example, once I go find these men, once I figure out who they are, I can go find them in census records. I can go find them in city directories, find out what they did after the war. I'll be able to attach those both to them as people, but also I can connect them to the network as well. So that is an important place to do. Here's that sticky. And then for those of you who are building networks that have map, where a map is important, you know me, I love a good map, okay? I'm thinking particularly about my network for Rachel and the passengers of the Amazon. Over 800 passengers on that ship. They all came from different places in England and Wales and Ireland and Scotland primarily. So once I get all their birth locations entered into on each of them as I upload them to the network, now it'll show me on a map where they all came from. Then after they immigrated, almost all of them ended up in Utah. Some ended up in Idaho or Arizona, but almost all of them ended up in Utah, but in different places in Utah. And so I'll be able to map their death locations or their marriage locations and see, again, on a map, how they all dispersed, or if there are clusters of them that ended up in the same place. And that's what I'm looking for particularly, is this visualization of that on a map. Now, there are other ways to visualize network data. And again, if you see that feedback option pop up on your network and you think about some of those things, please do let us know, because we would love to continue to build this out in a way that serves you and meets your needs. Now, there are other tabs here. There are other tabs here that you can, other than stickies. So this is just to narrow in or focus in on those lists that you're creating. Because what's going to happen for some of you, if you're creating, like Shannon, you're creating a network of enslaved people, or like me with a network of individuals who immigrated on a ship together. Some of your networks are going to become very large. And this is designed to help you manage that kind of data without having to do it in spreadsheets and sticky notes. And so we're just going to give you different views of that information so that you can quickly access it as your network grows. Okay, so that is kind of the design or the outline of the current network workspace. Now up here, when you're in a network, we're going to click on that. That's going to take you to your all networks page. So I know a couple of you, Marcia and Diane, and a couple of you are so excited to create networks, and you may end up with 5 or 10 or 50 different networks that you're working on. This is where you can go to see all of your networks. So existing, I'll show you in just a minute how to create a new one. We'll walk through that. But existing networks, okay, you can access them 2 primary ways. One is from this all networks page. Find the network, click into it. The other is from the profile page in your tree of any person in that network. So I can get to this network from this page, or I can get to this network from my grandfather's page in my tree. Okay. Okay, let's talk about how to create a new network. I made my screen ginormous. Now we need to zoom back out. So again, remember right now, because this is in beta, it is only available to anybody who has Pro Tools. And if you don't have Pro Tools yet, it is it's just you can add it on for just a month and try it, and then you can cancel it at any time. But you should see your Pro Tools shortcuts on your homepage on Ancestry over here on the right-hand side. And when you click through to that, you'll see all of the features available in Pro Tools. Okay, so we've been through this. If you haven't seen that video, if you just go to ancestry.com/education and scroll down, you'll see I did a Pro Tools Wednesday virtual event a few weeks ago. You can watch the replay of that. I walk through all of the other things on this page. Of course, Networks wasn't out at the time, but it shows up there now. So those are the three kind of entry points to Networks right now. When you click on Create a Network, here's how it walks you through that, okay? Give it a second. I'm on Zoom. It's got to catch up. Okay, it takes me to that Networks landing page where I can see all my networks. And then I have this Create New Network button. And the first thing we're going to ask you is what kind of a network it is. And again, we're just trying to spark your imagination for what's possible here. But also, if you categorize the network, it's going to help us understand what kinds of networks you're creating so that we can continue to build tools and features to serve the networks that you're creating. So let's just walk through a few of these, or maybe all of them. We've got a few minutes, and then I do see that there might be a couple of questions that have come in. So think first about family or life milestone networks that you could create. Now, your family tree kind of is in and of itself a network of people who are related to one another. But do you ever come across information and you're not sure how you're related or if you're related to this person, but you want a place to keep that information? So think about things like witnesses on a baptismal certificate or a marriage certificate, informants on a death certificate, DNA matches. You know you're genetically related to these people somehow, but you haven't figured out how, and you need to start building their family tree so that you can make that connection. Great place to do that. Maybe you inherited an heirloom or some kind of artifact or a letter or photo albums. Again, I have all those photo albums of my great-grandmothers. I suspect a lot of those are cousins, but I haven't proven it yet because I didn't have this workspace to start to work through some of that. That would keep it organized. So you can create a familial network. The other kinds of networks are generally going to be non-familial networks. So things like people who immigrated together or migrated together within a particular country, or people who emigrated together. Do you know the difference? Immigration means they're coming into a country, and emigration means they're leaving a country. So you've got people who come into a country together and people who leave a country together. You also, and there are lots of scenarios in family history where entire villages in Europe pick up and move to St. Louis or Detroit or wherever, and you don't understand the connection between the old country. Maybe you've hit a brick wall because you know your ancestor came from Germany, but to do German research, you have to know where in Germany they came from. And there's no records about your ancestors that say where in Germany they came from. Well, if you start researching the other people that immigrated with them or that ended up in the same neighborhood as them here in the United States, you'll probably discover there is some connection back to the old country. Who are the families intermarrying with theirs? Who are the neighbors? Who are the witnesses on their naturalization? All of that is information that could lead you to exactly where your ancestor came from, but you need a place to collect that. And Networks works beautifully for that. Another opportunity here for a network is just shared experiences. So I recently learned, literally like 2 weeks ago, I was doing some newspaper research looking for these individuals my grandfather served with in World War II. and came across an article about a car accident my grandfather had been in as a teenager. He had been hit by a drunk driver. He actually went partially blind in one eye, and there was a very significant lawsuit that my grandfather successfully won against the drunk driver. I had never heard that story. I didn't know my grandfather was partially blind. And how do you even be partially blind? I don't even know how that works. I should probably look into that. But that's how the article read. So here's this. And so now I'm just super curious about the other kid who hit my grandfather and what happened to him. So it's a little bit of a criminal investigation. I'm not related to that guy or to the lawyers or to anybody else that was involved, but I might want a place to put that information to dig into that research, a place to attach those records and that newspaper article and any other information that I find. So shared experiences, that's one I just uncovered in my tree that I might build a network around. Okay, local community and chosen family. Again, I mentioned my Battle Creek neighborhood. These are people who have been important to my life story, and I might want to start to collect that information. That information becomes important when you start looking at, again, migratory groups historically. I had an interesting experience at Roots Tech after sharing the story about the Amazon and the group of immigrants who came together very publicly. One of my colleagues, who literally I have worked with for 2 decades, who has sat not 20 feet from me in the office almost that entire time, he decided he was going to create a network about house histories. He grew up in the same house. His parents bought it, and he lived there his whole growing up years. And he wanted to know who owned the house before his parents and if anybody owned the house before that. So he wanted to trace the history of the house he grew up in. And what he discovered very quickly as he dug into it at Roots Tech, while he was like in between helping people in the Ancestry booth, was that the house had been, his parents had purchased the house from a gentleman named Richard Smewen. And he was so excited, like, that he was making this discovery. And he was sharing it with one of our other colleagues. And she said, "Did you just say Smewen?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Did you not hear Krista? That's the last name of her ancestor who came on the Amazon." And so he came over to me and we looked it up. And sure enough, the man who sold his parents their house that he grew up in, he is the nephew of Rachel Smewen. So 2 completely unconnected networks, but because we were digging into them, it gave us a conversation to have and a connection point that we wouldn't have had otherwise. I find synchronicities and patterns and things like that fascinating. They already happen all the time in family history. Any one of you who's ever taken an Ancestry DNA test and found that your 4th cousin is a kid you went to high school with, or somebody on your match list is the mom of a guy that was your trainer at your first job, like those kinds of things happen all the time in family history already. I think networks is just going to amp up this realization that we're all a lot more connected than we think, almost like in networks. Okay, there are religious groups, and certainly somebody mentioned that in the comments, right? But as you go back further in time, one of my brick walls is in North Carolina. And one of the few earliest records that I have about them is about them being the founding congregation of a particular church. Roaring Creek Baptist Church, I think is what it was called. And the other founding members are all listed on a charter. I'm going to create a network out of those individuals so that I can start to see, if any of them are related, but also I suspect many of them ended up in that little holler in North Carolina because they came from somewhere else together. And I can't figure out where my ancestor came from, but maybe some of the other people in that congregation will give me the clues that I need about where they came from before they ended up there. There's also groups of schools, education. I have a class photo of my grandfather's graduating class from University High School in Los Angeles. One of those big, long, like panoramic photos. That might be an interesting network. I also have a photo of my grandmother on the other side of her like 6th grade class, I think it is, like so in Green Forest, Arkansas, so interesting. Jobs, groups of people who work together in a particular organization or in a particular industry, super fascinating. We've mentioned enslavement, a really, really like unique way to use networks to keep people connected. Because if you've done any research into enslavement communities, you know that you have to research often the enslavers and sometimes the entire community of individuals. And you also know that individuals who are genetically related to each other, if they were enslaved, they often ended up separated into various different places around, even in the same community, but sometimes out of the community. And so families get broken up, and the community is what's going to help you start to put those pieces back together. And so to have a place to connect those individuals into a network, because sometimes they're genetically related to each other and sometimes they're not, but this allows you to keep them connected. There are also other kinds of atrocities in addition to enslavement that you might want to research. Indigenous communities, communities of refugees, individuals involved in the Holocaust or in a genocide, and keep track of that information. We've mentioned military. There's more than just World War II, which I'm super focused on right now, but Civil War service and other kinds of military service together. There's sports and entertainment people that a lot of you, some of you don't just research your own family history. I don't know if you're like me. I sit down to watch a television show, and if it is any historical element at all, I'm instantly like looking up the Wikipedia page or the IMDb page or the whatever, trying to learn more about this person. And then I go into Ancestry. I'm a nerd. You should know that. If you didn't know that by now, you do now. And then some of you might want to collect information about individuals buried together, because again, people buried together in a particular section of a cemetery, sometimes they're related to each other, sometimes they're not, sometimes they migrated together, so it gives you a place to start to make those connections. So when you create a new network, that's the first thing we're going to ask you is, what kind of a network is this that you're creating? And if you need some ideas or want some ideas, there you go. Now, there's a lot of questions about whether networks are going to be public or private. So right now, during beta, networks are private, which means even if your tree is public, my tree is public. Any one of you could go do a search for Fred Ross Cowan, born in 1922 in San Francisco, and my tree would probably be the first tree that came up. So I want you to think about that. You can go to my tree. You can see my grandfather. You will not see that network because right now networks are private. But the plan is ultimately to make them collaboratively, so I could then share that network with the other individuals who were served with my grandfather, their descendants. I don't suspect many or any of them are still alive, but their children and grandchildren very well might be. And so I can share that network with them. Or eventually I could choose to make that network public and hintable, so that if anybody came and built a tree and put their grandfather in it, and their grandfather was one of those men in that network, they would get a hint that this network exists. So that's kind of looking forward, some of the things that we are planning to do. So we are out of time. I hate that an hour goes so fast, but I have loved watching your comments fly by. I suspect some of you learned some new things today. Of course, as always, if you learned something new, I would love for you to put it in the chat so that I can read through those later. But really what I want to know is, if you're planning on creating a network, what networks you're thinking about creating, because the ideas that flow just fascinate me. I will read through those, and as I start creating networks, or as I find really fun networks that you're creating, I'll share those out on my social media. So if you follow me on Instagram, you'll be able to see some of those. I love the way that collaboratively together as a community, we spark ideas for each other, because we're all on this journey of family history discovery together. but I suspect we're all a lot more connected than we realize we are too. And networks is just one of the ways that we'll start to make some of those connections a little bit more quickly and that they'll be a little bit more meaningful. Well, that's all I have for you today. Until next time, I'm Krista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.